Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode on Decloux's Views. This is Richard Decloux, also known as Decloubach. Today, I wanted to do a video about St. Thomas Aquinas and some thoughts on him and his role, or what his role should be in theology today. Before I get into that, please like and subscribe, and you can also look at the pinned comment below if you want to support my efforts. I have a donation page through DonorBox that is associated with my blog, which is Sapientia Nulliformis. Anyway, that would help me to continue these videos, which is hard. I do work a full-time job, 50 hours or more a week, and it is time-consuming for me to do these videos, but it's my passion. I much rather do these than be at my day job. I'm also trying to finish my doctoral dissertation. Should finish next fall with my final corrections and additions. So please pray for me in that regard as well. But today I want to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas and his role in theology. And to start, I'd like to say that I think if you asked any person who the quintessential Catholic theologian is, almost anyone would say St. Thomas Aquinas. And I think that's true because he is somewhat distinctively Catholic in many ways. You won't really see too many Orthodox appealing to him. You won't see many Protestants. I mean, you might have some, but not many really appealing to him for their arguments. And part of that's historical. I mean, he lived in the 13th century, and the split between East and West, Catholic and Orthodox, had really just happened a couple centuries before, and they were, in fact, he was on his way to a reunion council, the Second Council of Lyon, when he died. So they were still trying to work out, fixing that schism during his own day. And the Protestant Reformation wouldn't happen for another few centuries, so like 2.5 centuries later. So there weren't any Protestants around when Thomas was alive. So anyway, he is in many ways the quintessential Catholic theologian, distinctively Catholic in many ways, and probably has had the most influence in theology in the Church's history. It's hard to argue that. I mean, he has been ignored, I think, in many ways, sadly, by a lot of different sects within the Church, theological schools. But as far as actual doctrine, it's hard to not see his influence. And I'm going to go into that a little bit. First of all, I'd like to talk about his method as much as I can. I'm not really an expert on that per se, so these are just my perceptions from what I've read and studied on St. Thomas Aquinas. One of the things that I think is amazing about St. Thomas is his ability to just absorb the tradition and look through Scripture and the Fathers and other scholastics and see whatever people are saying. I mean, the amount of material he draws from when he formulates his own positions on things is just absolutely astounding. Especially when you consider his day and age. It's not like he had Google. He didn't have internet access to JSTOR or other online sources. I mean, you had manuscripts written on scrolls and things, and you might have some books, but they're not, the printing press wasn't even invented yet. So the fact that he was able to just pour through all those sources and learn from them and absorb them and respond to them and synthesize them is extremely impressive. Extremely prolific theologian and writer, and well-versed in the sources. He was really adept at that. And there's actually a line from Aeterni Patris by Pope Leo XIII on the restoration of Christian philosophy that holds St. Thomas as sort of an epitome and an example to be followed in doing Christian philosophy. And there's a quote from that, number 17 of that document. It says, "Among the scholastic doctors, the chief and master of all towers Thomas Aquinas, who, as Cajetan observes, because, quote, he most venerated the ancient doctors of the Church, in a certain way seems to have inherited the intellect of all, end quote. And I think that's true. He loved reading the ancient doctors, the fathers of the Church, and drew a lot of his own material from that, and wrestled with what they were wrestling with, and sort of thought about it, and then drew from each of them to create a new synthesis and a way of expounding upon the themes found therein. And that's, I think, just that's the way theology should be done. And I think, he was one of the best in history at doing that. He also, of course, is known for, in many ways, Christianizing Aristotle, which was at the time, and this is something some people might not realize, was actually quite controversial. There were some condemnations of Aristotle that even touched upon some of his own writings in the 13th century, because up until then, really Plato and Neoplatonism had dominated Christian philosophy. And so bringing in Aristotle, especially since his writings were sort of reemerged in the West through Latin translations from Muslim scholars, that it was seen as a dangerous thing at the time. And so it wasn't without controversy that he latched on to Aristotle so strongly, because in some circles that was considered a rejection of the tradition. But Aquinas really, he's more of a Neoplatonizing Aristotelian, and St. Bonaventure is as well, from what I've read, but obviously holds Aristotle as the philosopher. But he does a great job of bringing in Aristotle when it's helpful. And that leads us, I think, into our next topic, which is, first of all, his ability to do his method of theology, where he does give primacy to revelation, to revealed truth, to dogma, and then defends dogma using philosophy. So philosophy for him is the handmaid of theology, and therefore his orthodoxy, I think, of course, is paramount in any good theological method, and is sadly not always valued today. But I think he was one of the best at doing that. And philosophically, his reasoning power, I think, is still unparalleled. In many ways, I love St. Bonaventure, and I'll probably do a video on Bonaventure at some point, in many ways. And Bonaventure, I think, has a tremendous amount of wisdom and vision, but at the same time, I don't think he can touch Aquinas' absolute logic and reasoning and argumentation. Although in some points, I think Bonaventure might have actually had the better of him on a point here and there. But that's a side argument discussion. But Aquinas' intellect was just phenomenal. I can't even imagine what his actual IQ must have been. Anyway, every year I get a cough for like 3 or 4 months, and this is obviously with this coronavirus not the best time for that, because everyone just, seems to think, oh, do you have it? No. But again, getting into the next segment, I want to talk about the expanse and depth, so the breadth and depth of his writings and his work. It's a little bit of a pause. I have I don't even know if you can read this. This might be backwards on your screen, so I apologize. Introverted but willing to discuss Thomistic metaphysics. It was a gift from my wife. Got from Pints with Aquinas from Matt Fradd, his shop. Love it. Anyway, but just the variety of topics that Aquinas discussed, and then the depth that he goes to in each of those topics is amazing. I mean, when you consider the fact that nowadays in most universities, as one of my proteges used to say, Father Matthew Lamb, we don't really have universities anymore. We have multiversities. What he means by that is we're so into specialties and subspecialties, and you become a master in this one area and you focus on that. where Aquinas was so good at delving into a lot of different topics and getting right into the nitty-gritty of it. I mean, his philosophy, his metaphysics, his epistemology, his ethics, even his works on the physics and politics, and even psychology, you could say. And then you get into his theology. He obviously is most known for his Summa Theologiae. I have the 5-volume set. I got this early on. Love it. It's such a wonderful work. Recovers almost every area of theology, left unfinished, of course. The Summa Contra Gentiles, against the Gentiles. De Malo. Commentaries on Boethius. A lot of what people don't realize, though, is he also wrote a lot of scripture commentaries. On Psalms 1 through 51, he wrote commentary on Job, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Matthew, and John, all of Paul's letters. He even compiled a compendium of patristic comments on the 4 Gospels. So we're talking about before how he loved the church fathers. He did a compendium of their commentaries on the 4 Gospels. So shout out to Chris Plants. He's very interested in the topic of Aquinas as a biblical theologian, a scriptural theologian. And I think he's got something there. But that's probably, sadly, one of the areas of Thomistic studies that's the most ignored. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I really haven't studied those, and I really think that's bad. As a theologian, I think that's something I'd really like to delve into. You think about the hymns that he wrote as well. I'm not going to go into all of those, but the beauty of those hymns that he wrote, the poetry of them, I mean, just the way he could express theological truth in such a beautiful way that was worthy of worship, divine worship, used in the liturgies, is absolutely astounding. He composed some of my favorite hymns, that just really touched the heart and raised the mind and soul to God. It's just amazing to me what he's able to accomplish in that regard. So when you think about all those different things he did, he wrote about pretty much every area of theology imaginable. You could argue maybe not ecclesiology as much. I mean, there's parts of it, but it really wasn't an area of study at the time. It was sort of just the milieu within which he did theology. But there is some of it in there. Now, in my own life, obviously very early on, from a young age, as any devout Catholic young man and growing boy, Aquinas was my favorite theologian before I even read anything of him. Simply because if you're a good Orthodox Catholic, then you love St. Thomas Aquinas because you've heard that he's the best, and there's reason for that. So in my own life, I think early on, definitely his 5 ways for discussing the existence of God was very important to me. The use that faith and reason, that revelation and natural reason go together, was always important to me because truth was always of paramount importance. And I got a lot of that from him, that it isn't faith or reason, but both going together. And that really affected me. In grad school, I had the privilege of studying under one of the premier Thomistic philosophers in the world, Monsignor John Whipple. Took 2 semesters of his metaphysics, which was all Aquinas all the time, and it was phenomenal. And in that, we also discussed his epistemology, his theory of knowledge. And overall, I'd say that I'm mostly a Thomist when it comes to my philosophy. And I think it best shines in ethics. I think he's just the best. And following him, people like Servais Pincares help make it accessible to us. But I think his ethics and thus also his moral theology have really been an influence on me. I don't think you can do good moral theology without Aquinas. I think whenever I've seen people try, they just go woefully astray. So I think absolutely essential for that. Um, I took a doctoral seminar course on Aquinas on the Incarnation and Passion, which was an absolute joy. And I wouldn't even describe the professor who led it as a strict Thomist in many ways, but it was a great course. We really delved into his writings on the Incarnation and Passion and helped open up some avenues of my own thought, especially on the headship of Christ, which is really nothing I'd really thought much about. I ended up writing my paper on that. It ended up being like 40, 45 pages long. And I need to reread that and learn from it again. But especially his understanding of the Passion and how it's redemptive was just, I thought, the best thing I'd written on the topic. And I had already studied theology many, many years before that. I mean, I already had a bachelor's in theology. I already had 2 graduate degrees in theology. I was working on my coursework for the 3rd, my doctorate of sacred theology and systematic theology when I took the course. So I had studied Christology many times already, especially the works of Anselm and Athanasius being my 2 favorite. And then I read Aquinas, and I was like, wow, he just makes this so much better. I mean, the way that he explains, I think he really perfects Anselm. He takes it to the next level and really makes it make more sense. It's, and I just love Aquinas on the Passion and how it saves and how it's really the love of Christ in enduring the Passion that is what's meritorious about it. And it's just a phenomenal work. Anyway, also his sacramental theology. It's hard to argue that he pretty much dominates our sacramental theology. Now, what does that lead me? That leads me to the final and perhaps main topic of this video, all that sort of background to this, which is my take on the place of Aquinas in theology today, or what his place should be. And this is just something that over the decades of theological study that I've done, that I've noticed, because I've gone to many different schools. I took courses at many different graduate institutions, and it seems that there are places that pretty much only do Aquinas and almost nothing else. And then there are places that do almost no Aquinas, except for maybe here and there, almost as an afterthought or an appendage. And I don't really like either approach. If I had to pick one, I'd probably side with those who do Aquinas. But I still think that that's a mistake. I don't think it should be all or nothing with Aquinas. I think Aquinas himself would agree with me on that. I think it would be really hard pressed for anyone to imagine that Aquinas would think you should only study me, and not just because of his whole mystical experience where he thought all he had written was straw. I just think that he would be against that himself, because that's not what he did. And when you think back to Aeterni Patris by, the 1879 encyclical by Leo XIII, that really put Aquinas to the forefront again. It was to follow his method. I mean, in the document itself, it says, look, there might be some aspects of his thought that we kind of have learned more about that, would suggest maybe we don't follow him on a specific minor point. But his method primarily, and his method involved reading Scripture, reading the Fathers, and that, I think, is his lasting legacy. And because he did such a good job of collecting, juxtaposing, and then synthesizing, helping to resolve apparent conflicts between them, and coming up with a new synthesis, he should be a primary source in theological education. And I do think that as much as I've studied and learned about theology, I still don't think we did enough Aquinas in most of my studies. I think he was not emphasized enough in a lot of my courses. And I think that's a shame. I don't, any area that he had written on, I think he should be discussed at some length in any course on those topics. And to not do that, I think is a detriment to the students in the class. And I don't think there should be a class where it's possible to discuss Aquinas that he should be left out of the discussion. I also do think that other sources should be read as well, including the sources that he himself used. I don't think it's a good thing to just say, well, Aquinas is Catholic theology. I don't believe that. There were 1,200 years before him, and there's been almost 800 years or so after him, 700 or 800 years. And there are good things in addition to Aquinas that do deserve to be looked at. And so I tend to not really gravitate towards those who are only Thomistic in the sense of that's all they study, or especially if they're just studying the commentators like Suarez and Cajetan rather than Aquinas himself. I'm not really a big fan of that, the neo-scholasticism or neo-Thomism in that sense, where it's just the commentators on Aquinas, because I don't think the commentators are as good as Aquinas, and I don't think the commentators themselves would think that they are. And I think sometimes they got them wrong. But those are very complex, detailed arguments to be dealt with by specialists. I certainly do think it's worthy to have people who are Thomist scholars, that is their focus. I think we need that. So that we have a wealth of good secondary sources. So I would encourage that. So I'm not denying that. I'm just saying for people who think that that's the whole of theology is to read commentators on Aquinas and nothing else. I don't think, if that's your specialty and that's what you contribute to theology, more power to you. We need it. I encourage you. But to say that that's the limit in the extent of Catholic theology is not true, and it's not Catholic. There's a lot of good fathers, both East and West, that I think we also need to read and draw from. There's other scholastics. I think St. Bonaventure is probably the least appreciated of the scholastics, and I think that he should be revived in many ways. There's also other great scholars. I'm not going to get into debates about who right now, but I do think that Aquinas should be a major part of theological studies, but not the only part. And I think to err in either direction really hurts one's education, hurts one's own theology and outlook, and it makes it not really Catholic in the full sense of the term. So that is my take. I think Aquinas needs to be an integral part of theological studies, and at the same time, I don't think he should be the only person we read. There's a quote that the Catholic podcast tweeted actually just yesterday about that, and it was a great quote from Henri de Lubac on that, where there were people that just read Aquinas and read the fathers or anything themselves, and he thought that was actually to betray Aquinas, because Aquinas would want you to read those sources as well. But anyway, that's my take on it, and I really do think, because of the poor condition of current Catholic theology in most places, the biggest error is the lacuna, the lack of Thomistic studies in theology. So that seems to be the bigger danger. I remember having discussions with a great, now priest, he was a seminarian at the time, who, in discussing theology with him, basically admitted to me that, well, he didn't find himself smart enough to um, get into all the complex arguments back and forth, so he just sticks with Aquinas because he knows it's safe. I really don't have a problem with that, because that's a humble admission that, look, I'm just going to stick with what I know is among the best of Catholic theology, because then I know I'm being orthodox, and I can commend that. At the same time, I think it's a little bit disingenuous and intellectually dishonest to think that because you love Aquinas, you're a perfect Thomist and you know everything, and that you're a genius because you love Aquinas and you defend Aquinas and everything. Because I guarantee you, unless you're a world-renowned scholar who's studied all these things, you don't know that you agree with Aquinas on every topic versus every person that disagreed with him. Okay? Unless you've actually gone through and looked at the arguments, for instance, universal hylomorphism, where him and Bonaventure disagreed. Most of us have never read the arguments on both sides, okay, and then come to the conclusion that Aquinas is right. We haven't done that work. So I don't have a problem with people just sort of loving Aquinas and having somewhat of a bias towards accepting him. I understand that, but there should be some humility there and recognition that even Aquinas himself would want you to not appeal to authority, but to look at the arguments themselves, and to, if you're interested in a particular topic, don't just say, well, because Aquinas said it. He'd actually want you to delve into the nitty-gritty and look at the arguments and even challenge them, because that's what Thomas himself would do. So just keep that in mind. But again, I think the angelic doctor, the common doctor, is an amazing theologian who should be at the heart of a Catholic education for many reasons. And also to be kept in mind is the fact that he's a saint, and that's the best reason to study his thought. He was holy. I mean, holy enough to have the mystical experiences that he did. And to have the love for the truth that he had, and to emulate his prayer and his piety is almost more important than emulating his theology, and I think he would agree. Pray, adore the Eucharist. That's really the hallmark of it. None of us can really be, theologians of his caliber. But we can certainly learn from him and devotedly love the truth of the Catholic faith that he so eagerly defended and expounded upon and illuminated. And I really do think we should have a renewal of Thomistic studies, and I hope that all of us will study him more in depth. As long as we recognize that we can't limit Catholic theology just to him, and that's the main point I'm trying to make here. And that's just basically a reflection of my own experience, that I don't feel like he was given enough in many of the courses that I took. I don't think he was given enough space and time. But I'm also glad that I read other things as well, and I think that they help expand my own vision, my own theology. But each of those things I do think needs to be in dialogue with Aquinas, because he almost always has something important to add, things that you might not have expected, like with me on the Incarnation and Passion. Things I thought I already had a good grasp on, he just raised it to another level. And so if you're involved in any area of theology, any subspecialty, look at what Aquinas said about it as part of your specialization, because you'll learn a great deal. And anyway, that's it for today. I know it's a little bit rambling, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I'd like to hear your thoughts as well. If you have any ideas for other videos, please let me know. I try to keep up with some comments. I can't respond to everything. I'm very busy, but I do like to hear from y'all. And again, I appreciate any support you can offer to me as an encouragement to do more work on this, and to like and subscribe. And I appreciate you. God bless.